So we're going to go to our next speaker now, who is Nina from Canada, 1990s dyke, who was a news editor at Angles or Angeles, the Lesbian Avengers Vancouver chapter. Angles, yeah. The December the 9th Coalition, the Gay and Lesbian Vancouver Police Liaison Committee, the Vancouver Women's Health Collective, before being a federal civil service employee. In 1998 was the first Pride marching unit, so of the federal government's employees. Nina has disability retirement, returned to activism, and is filing at the BC human rights level and awaiting a Supreme Court of Canada file number. Nina started life as an ordinary Canadian. Okay, so thank you so much, Nina, for coming on, and you're going to talk to us now. So over to you.
Yes, I was born in the era where observed females had lesser rights, and in the mid-80s, Canada did the Charter of Rights and separated from England after the Canadian suffragettes failed to get the vote at the Canada Supreme Court and got the vote for women upon appeal to the British court. So Canada didn't want our courts to be overturned, and so we separated, and the Charter of Rights was supposed to include marriage equality in the 1980s. So when it was actually signed, for a while, I graduated high school afterwards, so for a brief while I had equal rights on paper until I began dating and didn't have any. This is a picture of me in the middle of my government career, and that is a stress ball that I was one of many who was given out these stress balls during Public Service Appreciation Week. Employment equity was in Canada and affirmative action was in the US, and the idea was to alter the outcomes and equalize the access to opportunities for 4 particular designated groups. And I'm going to say them in the reverse order that they are normally said to make it very pointed. It is Indigenous, disabled, visible minority, and women. You can pick one category. When if we can go to the next slide, the employment equity was done because of the oppression by heterosexuals. And what we're looking at here is in the 90s, when I was the news editor, one of the news editors of Angles, Angles published from 1980 until 2004, and it started as the Gay and Lesbian paper. And this is the issue that bisexual was added to the Angles Gay and Lesbian, and this paper was primarily gay men the entire time. And this is a cover where I happen to be on the cover for the issue. And the article on bisexual was the very first time the paper ever had a reprint request. And so this was an article about bisexuality in amongst gay and lesbians, that bisexuals are not tourists, they are a unique sexual orientation. And these are alternate pictures that were going to be used on the cover, because this was the decade that the public in Canada found out that gays and lesbians were kept in the concentration camps at all and not released after World War II. So the pictures are showing, the one I would have liked to have been picked was the one with the triangle in the tree. And then these are just the other 2 pictures are me and the other model looking at different books. And so this decade, Little Sisters was having censorship, and this is where the Butler decision about pornography came into play with censorship. And because most pornography is based on a heterosexual model of male exploiting females, and the Supreme Court couldn't cope with, there was gay male porn that did not include women, and that there was lesbian porn that was actually made by and for lesbians that didn't actually involve heterosexuality. And so this is where we're going a little bit now with transgender, because this is where we get into who is doing the hate crime. Heterosexual men are the ones who invented the words homophobia and transphobia to explain that they had sexually assaulted or murdered someone as reasonable for being in the same room as a person who had particular demographic characteristics. And the murdering of people who are in the street, who are not white because white people are afraid of them, is the in public practice of that homophobia and transphobia that tends to occur more in bedroom type situations. So applying the trans lobby attempting to call anyone transphobic for not dating a trans person is a huge misuse of the word. And the government of Canada in 2016, when they passed the trans rights, they were actually passing special rights, not human rights. Human rights relate to the whole person, which I'm going to go back to employment equity. So the Indigenous, disabled, and visible minority groups includes men, and the word heterosexual is left off this list because this was primarily to address between heterosexual oppression. And gay and lesbians was only after court cases. In Canada, we had to fight for military service, we had to fight for marriage equality, we had to fight for divorce equality, as well as work and education access. And having those things in law has been completely undermined by self-identity, because the characteristics for which we were oppressed now are being claimed as hate crimes against trans, and previously bisexuals and lesbians and gays had been able to be in the room with trans people, and now being called bigots, we don't really have a reason to be. Also, just one last note of Angles. It took me 3 months to get the collective to agree to add bisexual, and it was my understanding after I left the collective that the trans activist who added transgender to Angles did so by letting offering to take the paper to press and just making the change after everyone else left, and it was never voted for and agreed to, and then it couldn't be undone afterwards. Okay, so this is about policing. And so this article, there was a gay and lesbian / Vancouver police liaison committee in the 90s. And it was actually the police who insisted on the / because they were unaware of / fan fiction, and the whole, the cops are beating us up and some of us are cops, and there's a whole, the village people fetishization of, job things. Yes, so and so this other picture, police complaints talk to Opal. That's a picture of Wally Opal. He was the justice minister in the 90s, and he was later premier of the province of BC. And in the 90s, he did a report where the police were really not able to deal with domestic violence situations between non-heterosexual couples. And when I later worked at RCMP, I took his report and was able to actually add gay gay was already on the domestic abuse form, oddly, in the 1980s. And then in 1999, I was able to add lesbian, bi, and transgender to that form. So this is where in the 90s we had AIDS was going on. The upper picture is the prostitute murder opens debate. This was a trans activist, Jamie Lee Hamilton, who's actually passed away. And there's a whole number of other ones that have, fought for the whole bathroom thing and went after, in the US, the Michigan Women's Festival was under, improper application of human rights. In Canada, it was the Vancouver Rape Relief and other women's organizations. And in the 90s, I was also a volunteer at the Vancouver Women's Health Collective. I returned to the Health Collective in 2001 to discover that the Women's Health Collective no longer does anything with women's health, which is where I first learned about this item up in the top here. It's an anti-rape relief condom. So a woman would wear this, and it's got barbs and spikes on the inside. So if she's raped, the male has to go to a hospital to get that device removed. Employment equity was set up to help the categories, and in the Indigenous, disabled, visible minority, what happens in those meetings is the men are at the table and the women make the coffee, and at the women's group, which is not specified to be white heterosexual, which it primarily is, it means the white women sit at the table and the other women make the coffee. And when the federal government began to recognize and include gay and lesbian employees in benefits, the employment equity groups did not want the budget to be divided by 5 or there to be a 5th group. So the government created a separate program called diversity, in which case they could avoid using the words gay and lesbian. And it was in that capacity, I was in the first committee at Revenue Canada when that was still an agency. It's now, when it was still a Crown department, now it's an agency. We were allowed to march in the Pride Parade, and the department did buy the banner. And we were the first government group, there was 8 of us who were marching in a Pride Parade, and we were not there to ask for money or votes. And we actually weren't a community group. What we represented was hope and inclusion, because this was a few years after the federal government had stopped actually purging the federal government of, gay and lesbian employees from the 1950s until 1992. And when the federal government of Canada, we had an election in 2007, and it changed to the Harper government. The Harper government undermined women's equality by removing equality from the status of women and undermined all the women's nonprofit groups. While at the same time, the trans lobby began suing women's groups to get into those public spaces. And so trans rights, rather than protecting trans from heterosexual men, ended up applying against women. And this is where they were special rights, because it puts ideas above whole person oppression and allows the co-opting. And really, we should not be indulging in the preferred pronouns, because it really is woman face, and it's not up for a man to self-identify and say he knows what it's like to be a woman and tell women what it's like to be women. I'm waiting for a Supreme Court number to take all of this to the Supreme Court, because I lost my career owing to heterosexual oppression, and then now the government changed the rules. So now there's no way for me to go out in public space, because now we don't have demographics to belong to and communities. And, not only, having a stranger walk up to you and tell you that you're a bigot because you don't want to date them and you don't even know them is absolutely ridiculous. And it's just beyond comprehension. I was a Vancouver Women's Health Collective volunteer in the 90s. I returned there in 2021 to discover non-binary trans have taken it over, and cultural side has happened. 50 years of health information for women has been shredded, as well as every woman who ever reported about the problems with doctors. So the doctors who are, so this is basically, trans are now supporting doctors by ending women's healthcare information and ending women collecting information on doctors and challenging doctors who can only observe. They are ordinary people. They assign nothing. They can observe and measure only. Yeah, same-sex marriage was used by people who were against marriage equality to invoke gay male anal sex to do disgust, and that's why same-gender marriage, or just the word marriage, was done by proponents. And so this is where gender is about sex, so it can't be separated.